are the Lamb.
Hi, everyone. Hoping that you all are well. Thank you for joining us. This is another responsive discussion. And so, what we're looking at is a question about history related to two entities specifically. And so, we are looking at this correlation between the Ish, of course, the Hebrew identity, and this entity known as AKHEN-ATEN. We will also be looking at this entity known as AMERIC-A, who was Akhenaten's daughter, and perhaps also known by Scotia or Scotia, as you recall, the mother of the Scots. We're going to be looking at that along with this name America. And we're going to see some odd correlations between all of this and America. And we are specifically looking at this odd correlation that has been observed related to the 18th dynasty. And so we are tying this together with our recent discussion on the Hebrews River, or the Maritza River, or all of those other names by which this river is going. And so we are also looking at all of these things together and this recent odd history of the changing of the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. And there are a few entities that are really focused on this particular change. And so we're going to see that there is some apparent correlation between, again, this name America, this historical entity known as Akhenaten, and then AMERIC-A, Scotia, and the Hebrew identity. Now let's start off looking at this news report coming out of Israel with this question: were Hebrews ever slaves in ancient Egypt? And the answer in this article is yes. Now let's quickly look at why this is offered as the answer. A couple of observations have been made related to what's noted as Egyptian history, but remember, Egypt is not as a word actually in scripture. But there are a few observations made about naming dynamics in what is identified as ancient Egypt. What has been noted is this ending in that IA, suggesting a relationship between that IA ending and the YA ending or beginning that's related to Yahweh. Okay, and so what has been noted is that there are indications in Egyptian history of a Hebrew presence based upon this finding of the IA, specifically IA at the end of the APER. And we've talked a little bit about this before. But what also stands out is that this article is indicating that this presence appears to have been during the 18th dynasty. Now, we have touched on this slightly before, but there seems to be a clear offering that this Hebrew presence is directly tied to the 18th dynasty. This is important because there's another entity tied to the 18th dynasty, suggesting that there's a relationship between the Hebrew presence and this other entity. Now, this article is particularly noteworthy because it's coming out of Israel. Now, what has been noted with respect to this article is that there were some Canaanite pharaohs that were ruling in what would be considered the lower kingdom. and they were coexisting with the Egyptian ruled Upper Kingdom. What's also noted, and it stands out, is that among these Canaanite pharaohs was an individual with this mysterious name of Yaqub. Yes, Yaqub. Where have we heard that before? Okay. And so there is an attesting to this in these artifacts from Egypt. Okay, so there's this interesting notation about this mysterious entity known as Yaqub, who's supposed to have been a pharaoh in Egypt. Now, the assumption is that this is related to the biblical tradition of the patriarch Jacob, because, of course, the other pronunciation of Jacob is Yaqub. And here you can see these depictions that are supposed to suggest that the Hebrews were actually in Egypt. And here is another depiction. And here you see yet another depiction. What is noted related to a number of these depictions is that there is variation in terms of phenotype. And so with respect to some entities, you see darker brown skin. With respect to other entities, you see lighter brown skin. But it's also noted that the hair, regardless, has significant volume to it. Now, this is definitely one of those examples where you have this interchange going on with respect to individuals asking questions and then someone researching the question that's asked and giving it back. And so it might look like in this instance that I am the teacher of this, but I am simply answering or expounding on a question that has already been asked. So this is not a question I was originally asking. I was not asking about this 18th century dynamic, but apparently this question is very important because there is this odd correlation between the presence of these Hebrews and the presence of this entity known as Akhenaten, and also the presence of this pharaoh entity identified as Yaqub. And so there's a lot of odd stuff going on here with respect to these various names. And we also see a variation of Aken, related to Akhenaten in Strong's. And so that name is present in scripture. And so we see here that there were various names offered for Akhenaten and various spellings. What's also noteworthy is Akhenaten was originally understood as Amenhotep. Okay. However, the name changed with the religious conversion to Atenism. And Aten also has some interesting dynamics going on with it. It does appear in some way to be related to Adon. Okay. So we're looking at Britannica here, and we're just going to quickly look at this notation about the presence of Akhenaten in the 18th dynasty, along with the Hebrews. And so we're going to just quickly look at that. Hopefully I did not conflate the 18th dynasty with the 18th century. However, here we have this notation about Akhenaten, identifying Akhenaten as a king specifically versus a pharaoh. But it's indicating here that Akhenaten was present and established this new cult dedicated to Aten during the 18th dynasty. Again, this is the same time period that you have this presence of these entities that appear to be Hebrews. It's also noteworthy that this name Akhenaten, meaning beneficial to Aten, has that Aten at the end of it, that ATON or that ATEN, which is correlating with the ADON. It's also noteworthy to point out this observation about the AKHEN part of the name. This AKHEN that goes along with AKHEN-ATEN is found at 5912 in Strong's, and it indicates that it means to twist or to pervert. And it specifically notes here that that name is an Israelite name, and it has been mentioned 6 times in Scripture. It also indicates that this is comparable to this other name, Akar, which is referring to trouble and being troublesome. And here we see that word Akar occurring in 5917 Strong's, again reiterating this idea of to trouble, but it goes on to indicate also this Akan, Akar, refers to disturbing and bringing calamity. Now let's go back to this observation about this Maritza River, also known as the Hebros River or the Hebrew River. The other names for the river are A-MERIC-A and A-MERIC. I want to point out something about this interchange dynamic again. So with A-MERIC-A and A-MERIC, there are other letters that could be there. And so this A-MERIC-A also could be Marissa. The A-MERIC could be Marig. And so there are interchanges with the C and the K, and also the C and the G, and the C and the S sounds. And so there is quite a bit of transliteration just with this one name, Maritza. However, Maritza, A-MERIC-A, and A-MERIC all appear to relate to another name. And here you can see it a little bit more closely, and also remember that Hebros, Ebros also looks like it can translate as Euros. And so we're going to look at another interesting correlation related to Hebros and A-MERIC-A, and we're also going to see some translations that point to this Marik and this Maritza and this A-MERIC-A. All of this is pointing to, in many languages, America. What we also note with this Maritza, this A-MERIC-A and A-MERIC, is this name is a variation of Merit. And who is Merit? Merit is supposed to be the daughter of AKHEN-ATEN. Her name was A-MERIC-A. Also, perhaps the same person as this Scotia or this Scotia that is tied to the so-called birth of the Ish. And here you can see the Maritza broken down a little bit. And when you separate out Merit and Aten, you see the distinction with Merit, and you can more readily see how it would be tied to this Maritza, this A-MERIC, and this A-MERIC-A. Now, of course, we've already noted how there are words that have these multiple meanings, and this merit is no exception. And so what you have with respect to merit, it's supposed to be beloved. And so you often see that mer, mar, more sound associated with this idea of love. However, you also see it corresponding to this idea of bitter. And so while you have merit-aten translating as or interpreted as beloved of Aten, really all you have is beloved or loved and Aten. And you also have bitter and Aten. Now we're going to look at some of these interesting transliterations that definitively tie America to this MERIC or this America naming dynamic, then that, of course, ties America to Hebrew or Euros or a variety of other related names. And so here you can see what happens with those letter interchanges. That, of course, creates a bit of confusion. And so when looking at this Maritza or this Marika, if you put the A on the front, you'll see what's going to happen here. So you have Marisa with an ISA. You have America when it's the ICA. And you have America when it's the IGA. And that ISA, ICA, and IGA are all interchangeable along with the A and the E in the middle. So now let's look at some transliterations. What's noteworthy with respect to the transliterations and the translations is that this Merik is definitely showing up as one of the Ish language words, and it is coming out of the Turkish. Translating into the English, we have this Maritza. We see Marik and Marik again, and then Maritza. Perhaps someone else can provide some clarity related to this because this is an odd dynamic. And it's particularly odd given the fact that there is historical rewriting going on at this very moment with this Gulf of America. And so there's some vested interest in changing this Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. And as we can see, this Gulf of America dynamic might be more related to Egypt or something east versus a tribute to America. And of course, there's so much confusion about where this name America came from. It's just noteworthy that there's this major push to suddenly identify this Gulf by this particular name. And so going back to the Turkish and going back into the Spanish, so we have Merik or Meris, and going into the Spanish, it's translating as Marico. Okay, what's interesting about this is if you just swap out that R for an X, you have Mexico. And so there's a question about the relationship between this name Mexico and this Americo. Okay, but you also see that this Marico is translating as American with the K replacing the C. Into the font, there's an interesting notation. It looks like Merik is translating as Malek. In other words, a king. Think of Malik. And so it's just an interesting observation coming from the Turkish into the Fawn. And into Albanian, it's translating as Merik and Meriku. And here we have this interesting observation coming out of the Turkish into the Amharic, and it looks like Meriki. It's also important to remember that with respect to the transliteration dynamic with this river, Amharic is also related to this translation of America. And so there is some indication that these words are synonymous. And here you see going into the Maori, this Merrick translating as Mary. And here you see an additional translation coming out of the Turkish. And you can see this Mariki again and this America meaning. And out of the Turkish into the Khmer language, you see America again. And here you see another transliteration with Mariki and America. And here we see another interesting notation related to this Maritza. And if you look down below, you see this Marika for Maritza. And so you see Maryca. And so Maritza, in and of itself, coming out of the Turkish, is translating as this Marika word. And here you see another transliteration, again with this Mexico, again looking very similar to Mexico. And here you see another transliteration in Latvian coming out of the AMERIC again with this America. And there is a focus on Mirica or America with the K versus the C. And here you see that America again. And here you see AMERIC and America. It's interesting to note again, you can swap out that R and that X, and one is pointing to America and the other one is pointing to Mexico. Again, bringing up some questions about the origins of both of these names, quite frankly. And here we have this Welsh translation and transliteration, and we have Meric, also referring to Mary and Marig. Hopefully that also helps to understand where that Amerigo might have been coming from, as in Amerigo Vespucci. Okay, so we have also a transliteration here with Marico and America again. And here we see it again. And interestingly, another notation suggesting Mary. And here we go again with the Maric and the interchange with the C and the K. And oh yes, here we have the Yoruba with this Maric coming out of the Turkish, going into the Yoruba as Maric again, and this Mariki or America. And finally, from the Turkish into the Basque, we have Maric, and then translating as Maric again. And then this Marikeko, also related to America. And so clearly we have a number of odd dynamics going on related to history and linguistics. And so we can see that there is this correlation again going on with respect to the Ish and Hebrews or Hebrew. And now also this relationship between both of those entities and Akhenaten and Merit-Aten or Scotia or Scotia, and this 18th Dynasty dynamic that we see. That's also relating to this Hebrews River that seems to be related to the, at least with respect to the narrative we have now, the origins or at least a central location historically for the Ish. And so we see a number of odd correlations here. And then, of course, there's this recent history of renaming the Gulf of Mexico, which might be some sort of exchange for America. It might even be the same word for all we know at this point. But we see this interesting rewriting of history, changing of the maps right before our very eyes. So we've been wondering exactly how this has taken place throughout history, assuming perhaps that historians were mixing things up or getting things confused. But apparently, it's not the historians that do this. It's the actual leaders and politicians and individuals who are in charge of altering or changing or enacting various laws. And so apparently that's who gets involved in this sort of thing, this sort of name changing and revising of history. Very interesting. And so hopefully this clarification has been helpful And perhaps individuals have a little bit more clarity that they might want to offer related to all of these correlations. Very odd indeed. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. We are the land. We are the land. We are the land.